Junyo stood in the center of the exam ring, and 20 goblins were closing in from every side. He had not moved in almost a full minute. The examiners behind the reinforced glass had stopped talking. One of them, a woman named Director Beck, leaned forward with her pen frozen over her clipboard. She had seen 400 rookie exams this year alone. She had never seen anyone just stand there while the swarm gate finished releasing its full count. The protocol was simple. Candidates were supposed to retreat toward the barrier, use the terrain, pick off stragglers, and survive long enough for the timer to end the trial. Most rookies lasted maybe 90 seconds before the panic button lit up under their palm. Junho had not touched his panic button. He had not even raised his weapon yet. The goblins closed the last few meters, teeth bared, claws scraping the concrete floor of the arena. To anyone watching, it looked like a young man about to be torn apart. Then he moved. It happened too fast for the cameras to catch cleanly. One heartbeat he was standing with his arms loose at his sides. The next, 4 goblins were already falling, throats opened by a blade nobody saw him draw. He spun through the pack low, almost lazy, like a man wading through tall grass rather than fighting for his life. A goblin lunged for his shoulder and lost its arm before the lunge finished. Another tried to flank him from behind and simply dropped, gutted, without ever getting close enough to swing. In the observation booth, the examiner beside Director Beck dropped his coffee cup. Nobody noticed the sound of it shattering. Every eye was locked on the boy in the ring. He wasn't using one weapon. That was the detail that would end up in every report filed that afternoon. A short blade appeared in his right hand for 2 goblins, then vanished, replaced by a spear that swept low and took out 3 at the knees. Somewhere in the blur he'd picked up a discarded goblin club and used it to crush a skull, before letting it clatter to the floor like it bored him. He fought like a man who had done this 10,000 times. He fought like the outcome had never once been in doubt. Within 11 seconds, 19 goblins were dead. The last one broke and ran for the wall, some flicker of animal instinct telling it that this was not a fight it could win. Junho let it get 3 steps before a small dark blade, more shadow than steel, passed through the air and dropped it where it stood. Silence settled over the ring. Junho exhaled once, rolled his shoulder like it ached slightly, and looked up toward the observation glass, waiting for someone to tell him the exam was over. Director Beck sat very still. She had been grading rookie exams for 6 years. She had seen strong candidates. She had seen prodigies. She had never seen anyone move like they were bored by the exercise. "Run his stat scan again," she said quietly. "There has to be a mistake." There wasn't a mistake. The scan came back exactly the way it had the first time. Level 1. Beginner rank across every category. A stat sheet that belonged to someone who had never set foot in a portal before today. None of it matched what they had just watched. What none of them could have known, what no scan or record could tell them, was that the numbers were the lie and the fight was the truth. 25 years earlier, a different version of this same man had stood at the top of a battlefield most humans could not have survived for 30 seconds. And he had walked away from it a legend. They just didn't know it yet. 25 years earlier, the world had a different kind of war going on. One fought inside the endless dungeon known as the Frost Queen's domain. By then, Seo Junho was already the strongest hunter alive. People called him Spectre, a name that had started as a rumor and become a fact. He could vanish into shadow and reappear behind an enemy's back before they registered the first movement. He had cleared floors that had killed entire raid parties. He carried scars from monsters most people only heard about in nightmare stories passed down from survivors. That day, his team of 4 stood with him at the entrance to the Frost Queen's throne chamber. They were the closest thing he had to family. A healer who never stopped joking even when she was bleeding. A tank who used to be a construction foreman and still swore like one. A mage twins pair who finished each other's spells the way other people finished each other's sentences. The Frost Queen was ancient, cruel, and powerful enough that entire nations had tried and failed to bring her down. She commanded ice that could freeze blood in a vein before a person even felt cold. She had killed 6 previous raid parties sent against her, and every one of those parties had included stronger numbers than Junho's team of 5. They went in anyway. The fight lasted for hours. Walls of ice rose and shattered. The tank took a hit meant to crush him into paste, and survived only because Junho was already there, already cutting the attack short with his own blade half a second before impact. The healer kept everyone standing through sheer stubbornness, patching wounds that should have ended the fight 3 times over. In the final stretch, the Frost Queen unleashed something no report had ever described. A storm of absolute zero that swept the entire chamber, the kind of attack meant to end a fight permanently. Junho saw it coming a half-second before it hit, and made a choice nobody else on that team could have made for him. He put himself between the attack and his friends. The last thing he remembered was cold that didn't feel like cold anymore, more like something closing over him from the outside in, sealing him where he stood. He remembered the sound of the healer screaming his name. He remembered driving his blade into the Frost Queen's chest with the very last motion his body had left in it, and he remembered her shrieking as she shattered into a storm of ice shards around them. Then there was nothing, not death, something stranger, a frozen kind of sleep that swallowed 25 years whole. He woke up in a containment facility that smelled like antiseptic and looked nothing like the world he remembered. His body ached in ways that made no sense until he understood what had happened to him. The ice hadn't just trapped him, it had reset him. Whatever process had kept him alive through 2.5 decades of frozen stillness had stripped his stats back down to nothing, back to level 1, back to the same numbers a fresh player would carry on their very first day in a portal. His mind was untouched. Every skill, every instinct, every hard-earned scar of experience from a lifetime of fighting was still there, but his body could barely hold a sword steady for more than a few minutes without shaking. A bald man in a rumpled suit was the one who found him first, alerted by an automated system flag nobody had checked in years. Shim had been a mid-tier player back when Junho vanished, someone who idolized Spectre from a respectful distance and never expected to actually know him. Now he was president of the Player Association, gray coming in early at his temples, staring at a man who was supposed to be a legend from a bedtime story. "You're actually alive," Shim said, and his voice cracked on the last word. Junho sat up slowly, testing muscles that felt borrowed from someone else's body. "How long? 25 years?" Shim swallowed hard. "Junho, I need you to understand something before you ask anything else. We're still on floor 1. For a moment, Junho didn't understand the weight of that sentence. Then it landed. "1 floor," he repeated. "In 25 years. The second floor gate opened 8 years ago. Barely anyone can survive past the entrance zone. We lost 3 of the 6 great guilds trying." Shim's hands were shaking slightly. "Humanity's strongest advancement in a quarter century, and it's a gate we still can't push past." Junho said nothing for a long moment. Somewhere beneath a mountain of ice that no longer existed, 4 of his closest friends were still frozen exactly the way he remembered them, trapped in the aftermath of a battle that had, in the world's eyes, ended in silence and legend rather than victory. He needed strength. Real strength, enough to safely thaw whatever prison still held his team without killing them in the process. And right now, his stat sheet said he was a level 1 nobody. There was only one way to close that gap. He would have to climb it again, floor by floor, fight by fight, exactly like everyone else. Except he already knew exactly how to fight, and everyone else did not. The rookie exam had been the fastest way back onto the official record, a way to get a player ID and start moving through portals without drawing suspicion from people who might remember the name Spectre. He had gone in intending to pass quietly. Quietly had not exactly happened. Now, standing in the debrief room while 3 examiners argued in hushed, frantic tones about how to file his results, Junho let them sort out their confusion. He had bigger problems. He needed strength fast, and he needed information faster, because the demons that used to be rare and dangerous outliers were apparently everywhere now, embedded in guilds, in politics, in places nobody thought to look. His first real hunt after the exam took him into a portal called the Curse of Dawn, a place that fed on regret and buried its rewards behind trials built from a person's own worst memories. He walked through illusions of failure that meant nothing to a man who had already survived worse than any dungeon could invent, and at the center of it he claimed a skill few players ever unlocked. The ability to read the final memories of the dead. It would become the single most useful tool in his hunt for the truth, though he did not know that yet, not fully, not until a portal called the Garden of Lilith showed him exactly how far the world had fallen while he slept. He found the diary first. A young rookie archer, Tushar Vichy, had kept careful, hopeful notes about his fiancée, about the modest apartment they were saving for, about a portal contract that was supposed to be simple and safe. The final entries were not hopeful. They described a trap, a demon wearing the shape of a friendly guide, and a slow, desperate fight that both of them lost. Junho read the dead man's final memory with his new skill, watching through Tushar's eyes as the demon peeled away its harmless mask and the trap closed around two people who thought they were simply doing a routine job. Something in his chest went cold, in a way that had nothing to do with ice magic. He hunted down every trace the memory gave him. The demon responsible didn't survive the encounter, and Junho recovered the archer's bow, carrying it forward not as a trophy but as a promise. Somewhere out there, more of these things were hiding in human skin, waiting for people who trusted too easily. Word had started to spread before Junho even realized it was spreading, not his name. Nobody knew his name yet, just whispers about a rookie who moved like something out of an old war story, the kind veterans used to scare new players into taking their training seriously. He didn't care about the whispers. He cared about the gap between where he stood now and where he needed to be. And the fastest way to close that gap was money, gear, and information, none of which came free. A private contact of Shim's reached out about a VIP case that paid absurdly well for a low-risk job. A wealthy family's daughter had contracted a wasting sickness after a portal accident, something the hospitals couldn't explain and couldn't cure. Corrupted yin energy, according to the specialist who examined her, slowly poisoning her from the inside, with no clean way to extract it. Junho didn't need the specialist to tell him what he already suspected. His frost skill, the one thing he'd carried out of the Queen's shattered core along with his own devouring shadow power, wasn't just for freezing enemies solid. It was built to absorb energy, and yin energy in particular seemed to answer to it like an old, familiar language. He laid a hand over the girl's chest while her parents held their breath in the doorway, and pulled. It worked better than he expected. The sickness drained out of her in slow, visible waves of frost that curled around his fingers before dissolving into nothing, and more importantly, his own magic stat ticked upward the moment the last trace of her corruption vanished into him. Not just healing, fuel. That single quiet afternoon told him something enormously important about the tool he was carrying. His frost wasn't a one-note weapon, it was a permanent upgrade path, if he was willing to go looking for sources. The girl's father tried to pay him triple the agreed rate. Junho took exactly what was promised and left, before anyone could ask his name. The Black Market District ran a very different kind of economy than the guild halls, one built on stolen gear, unlicensed contracts, and men who liked to remind newcomers exactly whose territory they were standing in. 3 of them cornered him near a gear stall that evening, calling themselves the Gangnam Trio like it meant something. They wore matching jackets and matching sneers, the kind of confidence that came from years of nobody in this district being foolish enough to challenge them. "New face," the tallest one said, cracking his knuckles. "You don't know how this works yet. Consider this a lesson." Junho considered telling them to walk away. He decided against it. Some lessons only stuck after they hurt. The fight lasted 4 seconds. The tallest one swung first, and found his fist caught mid-air. His wrist bent at an angle that made him scream before he even registered pain. The second one tried to draw a blade and lost the hand holding it. The third simply ran, and Junho let him go, because chasing down a coward wasn't worth the time. Somebody had been filming on their phone from a stall across the alley. By morning, the footage had a few thousand views. By that evening, it had a few 100,000, tagged with names like Mystery Rookie and The Black Market Ghost. Gong Juha saw the clip on her 3rd scroll through the evening's guild reports, and unlike most viewers, she didn't watch it once and move on. She watched it 4 times, pausing on the wrist break, studying the economy of motion like she was grading an exam. As the leader of a fire-based guild that specialized in aggressive, overwhelming offense, she knew exactly how rare it was to see someone win a fight using less effort than it took to lose one. "Find him," she told her second-in-command. "I want to know who this is before every other guild in the city does." She had no idea, of course, that the man in that shaky phone footage was the reason half her guild's oldest members had grown up hearing stories about a hero named Spectre. She just knew talent when she saw it, and she intended to have it working for her. The East Sea portal opened a week later, an S-rank gate that had chewed through 2 previous raid parties before anyone managed to close it. Junho joined not for the fame, though the fame followed anyway, but because the reward pool included a stat-boosting relic he genuinely needed. 2 other hunters joined the party that day, brothers by the name they gave, polite and competent and a little too careful with how they positioned themselves during briefings. Junho noticed it within the first 10 minutes. The way their eyes tracked exits more than threats. The faint red undertone that flickered in their irises when they thought nobody was looking closely enough. Demons, wearing human faces well enough to fool most players, but not well enough to fool a man who had spent decades learning to smell that particular kind of wrongness on a person. He said nothing. He let them think their disguise was working. He let them plan whatever they were planning, patient in a way that unsettled even the more experienced players in the party, who kept glancing at him like they weren't sure why the newest member of the group seemed so calm heading into a dragon's lair. The nameless dragon that ruled the deepest chamber of the East Sea portal was old, vicious, and used to winning. It came at the party like a wall of teeth and flame, and for a few brutal minutes it looked like the raid might end the way the last two attempts had ended, in retreat and body counts. Junho didn't retreat. He met the dragon's charge head-on, ducking beneath a jaw big enough to swallow him whole, and driving his blade up through the softer scales along its throat. Ice spread from the wound in spiderweb patterns, locking joints, slowing blood flow, buying the rest of the party seconds they desperately needed. The dragon thrashed, screamed something that shook dust from the cavern ceiling, and Junho climbed its own flailing body like a man scaling an unstable cliff, driving the killing blow home between eyes that had watched hunters die for 100 years without ever expecting to lose. The moment the dragon's massive body crashed to the cavern floor, Junho didn't wait to celebrate. He turned toward the two brothers standing at the back of the party, already backing away with expressions that had slipped, just slightly, into something far less human. "You were going to wait until the dragon wore us down," Junho said, calm, almost bored. "Then finish off whoever was left." The taller one's mask cracked fully, red bleeding into both eyes. How? He didn't get to finish the question. Junho closed the distance in a blur of shadow, and the fight that followed wasn't really a fight at all. It was closer to a formality. Both demons ended up torn apart on the cavern floor before the rest of the party even understood what was happening, and Junho pulled the last flickers of memory from the taller one's corpse, cataloging names, contacts, a hierarchy of demon operations spreading further into human society than any official report suggested. The party stared at him in silence as he stood over the bodies, dragon blood and demon blood mixing on the stone beneath his boots. "Who exactly are you?" someone finally asked. Junho didn't answer. He was already thinking about the next lead the memories had given him, a name connected to a Vegas auction house, and an item called the Divine Breath that the demons apparently wanted very badly. The auction house in Las Vegas had been chosen for its reputation of discretion, the kind of place where wealthy collectors bid on relics without ever having to explain where their money came from. Junho arrived under a borrowed invitation, dressed the part, blending into a crowd of buyers who had no idea one of the items up for bid that night, the Divine Breath, was something demons wanted badly enough to kill for. He felt the wrongness in the room before he saw it. A tension in the air, faint traces of that same red-tinted scent he'd learned to recognize in the East Sea portal, scattered among the catering staff and a few of the well-dressed guests moving too smoothly through the crowd. The ceiling came down 11 minutes into the bidding. Not literally, not at first. First came the screech of failing supports, dust raining from the ornate plaster, and then the whole upper section gave way in a roar of collapsing stone. Skeletal shapes poured through the gap before the dust even settled, dozens of them, animated bone constructs clearly summoned rather than natural, moving with a coordinated purpose no random monster spawn would ever show. Panic did what panic always does. Guests scattered, security fired blind into the chaos, and somewhere in the confusion, a figure in a long coat slipped toward the display case holding the Divine Breath like she'd rehearsed the exact path 100 times. Junho let her take it. He didn't chase through the chaos of the collapsing hall. Chasing was for people who didn't already know where a rat would run once the trap sprung. He simply worked his way toward a side exit, cutting down 2 skeletal constructs on the way without breaking stride, and waited. She came out through an alley behind the building 20 minutes later, moving fast and confident, the kind of confident that only exists in someone who has never once been wrong about an escape route. She had good reason to feel that way. Her contract with the demon faction included a teleportation clause, a guaranteed exit the moment she cleared the building's wards. She never got the chance to use it. Junho's frost closed around her ankles before she felt the temperature drop, spreading up through her legs, freezing her mid-stride like a photograph of a person still running. She screamed once, short and sharp, before the ice reached her throat and cut the sound off entirely. He walked over slowly, took the divine breath from her frozen fingers, and pressed 2 fingers to her temple. Her memories came to him in fractured, hurried pieces, the way memories always came from someone who hadn't expected to die that night. A name surfaced clearly enough to matter: Arma. The demon running skeleton summoning operations across 3 different cities, someone high enough in the hierarchy to have access to genuine relic-grade summoning circles. Junho let the ice finish its work and walked away with the item and the name both. Arma turned out to be exactly the kind of demon Junho had learned to expect by now. Comfortable. Overconfident. Convinced that whatever human authorities existed were too slow and too soft to ever actually catch up to what the demon factions were building in the shadows. He found Arma 3 days later in a warehouse repurposed as a summoning workshop, skeletal remains stacked along one wall waiting for reanimation, bone dust coating every surface like gray snow. Arma looked up from a half-finished summoning circle when the door opened, more annoyed than alarmed. "This is a private operation," Arma said, red eyes flicking over Junho with dismissive boredom. "Whoever sent you, tell them the price just went up." "Nobody sent me," Junho said. "I came on my own." Something in his tone must have registered, because Arma's boredom cracked just slightly, replaced by the first flicker of genuine caution. It wasn't enough. Junho crossed the warehouse floor before Arma finished reaching for the summoning circle's activation rune, and the fight that followed was brief and entirely one-sided. Arma tried 3 different bone constructs in rapid succession, each one shattering under Junho's blade before it finished forming. And the final blow came almost gently by comparison. A shadow blade through the chest that ended things before Arma even understood the fight was already lost. Junho read the memories carefully this time, patient, thorough. Arma's operation connected to something larger, a network stretching back to Rome, something involving children and an orphanage, and experiments that made his stomach turn even second-hand, filtered through a dead man's fading recollection. He filed the location away. That thread would need to be pulled soon, and pulled carefully. For now, there was still the matter of the Wild Forest. The Wild Forest raid had been organized for months before Junho ever joined it. A 200-player operation against a portal infested with corrupted dark elves who had spent the last decade slowly poisoning the surrounding wilderness with their twisted magic. 6 guilds had pooled resources for this one. It was the kind of raid that made careers or ended them. Junho joined as an independent contractor, technically unaffiliated, which suited him fine since he had no interest in guild politics slowing him down. Gong Juha's guild was among the 6, and she made a point of finding him during the pre-raid briefing, arms crossed, studying him with open curiosity. "You're the one from the black market video," she said. "Not a question. Word travels fast." "Word travels exactly as fast as I tell it to." She tilted her head, fire-orange eyes narrowing slightly. "You fight like someone who's done this before. A lot. That doesn't match a fresh player ID." Junho shrugged, giving nothing away. "Maybe I learn quick." "Nobody learns that quick." She studied him a moment longer, then let it go, filing the mystery away for later rather than pressing. "Stay close to my formation once we're inside. I don't like wasting good talent to friendly fire." He didn't stay close to her formation. He had his own priorities once the raid began, and those priorities led him deeper and faster than the main force intended to move. The forest itself felt wrong the moment the party crossed the portal threshold. Trees bent at unnatural angles, the ground soft with a corruption that seeped up through boots and made skin crawl. Dark elves came at the raid in waves, faster and more coordinated than expected, clearly directed by something with actual tactical sense rather than mindless portal spawns. That something turned out to be the Elven King, or what remained of him after years of corruption had twisted a once noble ruler into something barely recognizable as the same species. He commanded the forest itself, roots and branches responding to his will like extensions of his own body, and within the first 20 minutes of contact, he'd already collapsed 2 of the raid's forward positions. Junho reached the king's clearing well ahead of the main force, cutting through corrupted elven warriors with brutal efficiency, leaving a trail other players would later follow just by counting the bodies. The king noticed him coming and seemed almost amused by the audacity of a single fighter approaching alone. "You come to die faster than the others," the king said, voice layered with something ancient and rotted underneath. "I come to end this," Junho said. The fight tested him more than anything since the dragon. Roots erupted from the ground trying to swallow his legs whole. Branches whipped through the air fast enough to shred lesser fighters into ribbons, and the king's own blade work carried the memory of centuries even through the corruption twisting his mind. Junyo took a shallow cut across his ribs early, the first real wound he'd suffered since waking from the ice, and something about the pain sharpened his focus rather than slowing him. He fought smarter, not just harder. He let the king's roots overextend, chasing him through the clearing, then froze the ground beneath the creature's own feet, locking those roots in place for the half-second he needed to close the distance. His blade found the gap between corrupted bark and whatever remained of flesh underneath, and the king's scream shook birds from trees a mile away before the corrupted ruler finally fell still. The main raid force arrived roughly 90 seconds later to find the fight already over, Junho standing alone in a clearing littered with the king's shattered remains, breathing hard for the first time in weeks. Gong Juha was among the first to reach him, and whatever professional composure she'd been maintaining slipped, just slightly, into something closer to disbelief. "You killed him, alone. He was overextending," Junho said simply, like that explained everything. It didn't, not to her, but she'd stopped expecting normal explanations from him days ago. The reward pool from the Wild Forest raid included something unusual buried among the standard gear drops. A small, frost-veined egg that pulsed faintly with residual magic. Most players who noticed it assumed it was junk, a decorative curiosity not worth the inventory slot. Junho recognized the signature the moment he touched it. Frost energy, old and familiar, the same particular flavor of power that had once belonged to a queen who'd frozen him solid a quarter-century ago. He carried the egg back to a quiet corner of his apartment that night and set it on the table, watching frost spread delicate patterns across its surface in the lamplight. Slowly, over the course of an hour, the shell began to crack. What emerged wasn't the towering, terrifying figure he remembered from that final battle. It was small, barely the size of a house cat, translucent blue and shivering, blinking up at him with an expression that managed to be both regal and deeply annoyed at the indignity of its current size. "You!" the tiny spirit said, voice carrying an echo of the booming authority it clearly remembered having once possessed. "You're the one who killed me. You're the one who froze my friends," Junho said. They stared at each other for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, an old grudge too complicated to resolve with simple anger anymore. "I want television," the Frost Queen announced eventually, apropos of nothing. "And food, preferably something sweet." Junho found himself, against every expectation he'd carried into that conversation, almost smiling. The Cave of Trials wasn't listed on any official portal registry. Junyo had learned about it from a fragment of memory pulled off a dying veteran years ago, in his old life, a place that tested a fighter's limits rather than simply throwing monsters at them. He'd cleared it once before, decades ago, and the title he'd earned there had been part of what made him strong enough to face the Frost Queen in the first place. He needed that title again. His current pace of growth was fast, faster than anyone his age should have managed, but it still wasn't fast enough to reach his friends before whatever remained of the demon hierarchy regrouped and came looking for the man responsible for gutting 3 of their operations in barely a month. The entrance sat at the bottom of an abandoned mining shaft 2 hours outside the city, sealed behind a rune circle that hadn't been triggered in years. Junho activated it alone. Some trials weren't meant to be shared. The gravity hit first, the moment he stepped through. Not crushing, not immediately dangerous, but a steady, grinding weight that made every step cost twice what it should. His body, still rebuilding from level 1, strained under it in ways his old max-level frame never would have noticed. He pushed forward anyway, one heavy step after another, refusing to let the trial's first layer slow him more than it had to. The illusions came next. He'd expected monsters. What he got instead were faces. His old healer appeared first, standing in the mist ahead of him exactly as he remembered her, mid-laugh at some joke only she found funny, blood already soaking through her side from a wound that had never actually killed her. Not really. Not in the timeline he remembered. The trial had reached into his own memories and pulled out the version of her frozen alongside the others, twisted into something hostile, something that lunged at him with her own familiar fighting stance the second he got close. Junho's hands shook the first time he raised his blade against her. He knew it wasn't real. He knew the trial fed on doubt, on hesitation, on exactly this kind of moment where a person's love for someone became the crack it could pry open. Knowing didn't make the blade feel lighter when it finally connected, didn't make the illusion's dissolving scream any easier to hear. The tank came after her, Then the mage twins together, each fight harder than the last, not because the trial made them stronger, but because each victory cost something Junho didn't have an easy name for. He fought through them anyway, jaw locked, refusing to let the mist see him break even as something in his chest cracked wider with every illusion he put down. By the time the last one faded, he stood alone in silence, breathing hard, hands still trembling slightly. The void came next, and it was worse in a different way. No gravity here, no illusions either, just absolute darkness and absolute silence. A sensory deprivation so complete that his own heartbeat became the loudest thing in his world within minutes. Most candidates who attempted this trial broke somewhere in the first hour, minds unraveling without any external reference point to hold on to. Junho had survived worse silences. He'd survived 25 years of ice with nothing but his own thoughts for company, an experience the trial's designers had clearly never accounted for when building this particular test. He simply waited, patient, letting the darkness stretch on, refusing to give it the panic it was hunting for. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, time meaning very little without light to measure it by. Eventually, faintly, a single point of illumination appeared in the far distance, a door the trial finally deemed him worthy of finding. He walked through it into blinding light, and the sudden, disorienting return of his own body's full weight settling back to normal. A voice, ancient and formless, spoke from everywhere and nowhere at once. Few complete the void without breaking. Fewer still walk through the memory trial without hesitation costing them the fight. I hesitated, Junho said. I fought anyway. That is the point, the voice answered. The trial does not reward those without fear. It rewards those who move through it regardless. Light gathered in front of him, coalescing into words that burned themselves into his awareness rather than his eyes. Title acquired, Lemonade Breaker. Bonus stats granted on every subsequent level gained, a permanent multiplier stacking quietly behind every future fight he'd ever take. He walked out of the mining shaft 2 days after entering, blinking against ordinary sunlight, carrying a title that would make every level from here forward count for more than it should. The Frost Queen was waiting on his windowsill when he got home, deeply unimpressed by his absence. You were gone for 2 days. The television was very boring without someone to complain to. I was busy. You're always busy. She flicked her tiny tail. There is ice cream in the freezer. I finished it. You should buy more. Junho didn't argue. Some battles weren't worth fighting. The lead from Arma's memories had been sitting in the back of his mind for weeks now, waiting, and he'd delayed pursuing it as long as he reasonably could. Rome, an orphanage called Paradise. Children. He'd put it off partly because the raids and trials genuinely needed his attention, and partly, if he was honest with himself, because some part of him already suspected what he'd find there and didn't want to be right. He flew out under a false identity, dressed like an unremarkable tourist, and spent 2 days simply watching the building from a distance before making any move. Paradise looked, from the outside, exactly like what it claimed to be. Clean walls, a well-tended garden, staff who smiled warmly at the handful of children visible through the front windows. The wrongness was in the details, if a person knew to look. The garden was tended to perfectly, hedges trimmed with an obsessive precision that suggested someone terrified of a mistake being noticed. The children who came to the windows never stayed long, pulled back by staff members whose smiles never quite reached their eyes. And underneath it all, faint but unmistakable to a nose trained by months of hunting demons, that same red-tinted wrongness clung to the building like a scent no amount of cleaning could fully scrub away. Junho requested a tour under his false identity, claiming interest in a donation. The staff member who greeted him, a woman named Torres Milo, was polished and warm and entirely convincing, right up until Junho's memory-reading skill brushed against her during a handshake that lasted a fraction of a second too long. What he saw in that fragment turned his stomach in a way none of his previous hunts had managed. 24 years of it, children brought in under false pretenses, force-fed demon blood in carefully measured doses, monitored and cataloged like laboratory subjects, while the ones who survived the process were quietly extracted for something the memory only called the replication project. The ones who didn't survive were simply removed and replaced, the cycle beginning again with fresh, hopeful new arrivals who had no idea what waited for them behind Paradise's warm smile. He asked, keeping his voice carefully level, what exactly the replication project was trying to build. The answer came through in fragments, pieced together from things Torres herself only partially understood. higher-level operatives keeping the full picture compartmentalized even from their own staff. Someone powerful, decades ago, had possessed a rare and devastating shadow skill. Watcher of Darkness. The demon hierarchy had spent years trying to recreate that power artificially, convinced that if they force-fed the right children enough demon blood in the right sequence, they might eventually produce a second version of whatever monster had once carried that skill naturally. Junyo's blood went cold in a way that had nothing to do with his frost magic. He knew exactly whose skill they were trying to replicate. He'd carried it his entire life. Every child who had died screaming in this building had died because of a power that belonged to him. His existence was the reason for all of it. Junho stood very still in the hallway for a long moment after the memory faded. Torres Milo's warm, professional smile still fixed in place in front of him, utterly unaware of what he'd just seen. "Is everything all right?" she asked, tilting her head with practiced concern. "You look pale." "I'm fine," he said, "just thinking about the donation amount." The lie came easy. Everything after this point would not be easy, but the lie was. He asked for a tour of the lower levels, the parts not usually shown to prospective donors, framing it as due diligence, a wealthy patron's right to see exactly where his money would go. Torres hesitated for the first time, a flicker of genuine caution crossing her face, but greed and years of successfully fooling far more suspicious visitors won out. She led him down a service stairwell most children never saw, into a level of the building that smelled faintly of antiseptic, and something underneath the antiseptic that Junho recognized immediately as old, dried blood scrubbed at but never fully erased. The lab itself sat behind a reinforced door that required a keycard and a password. Torres kept talking the whole way down, something about funding allocations and administrative overhead, words that meant nothing next to what Junho already knew was waiting on the other side of that door. He let her open it herself. Inside, 3 staff members in lab coats worked at stations lined with containment vials, dark red liquid cataloged and labeled with clinical detachment, as if the contents were nothing more than routine pharmaceutical samples rather than the blood used to poison children. A 4th figure stood near a monitoring station, reviewing data on a tablet, red eyes flicking up briefly at the new arrivals before returning to his screen, entirely unbothered by an unexpected visitor. "Torres," the figure said without looking up again. "Who is this?" "A donor," Torres said, though her voice had gone slightly tighter. He wanted to see the full operation. Did he? The figure finally looked up properly, studying Junho with the same dismissive boredom Junho had grown used to seeing on demons, who hadn't yet learned better. "Strange time for a tour. We're mid-cycle on batch 14. Junho didn't answer. He was doing the math on how many rooms this facility likely had, how many children, how many years of batches that phrase implied, and the number made something in his chest go very quiet and very cold. "You should leave," the figure continued, apparently reading Junho's silence as fear rather than what it actually was. "This area isn't part of the standard tour." "I know," Junho said. "I asked to see it anyway." Something in his tone finally registered as wrong. The figure's hand drifted toward a weapon at his hip, too slow. So much too slow. Junyo crossed the room before anyone in it finished processing that he'd moved at all. The 3 lab technicians went down first, fast and clean. No theatrics, no wasted motion, because whatever fury sat coiled in his chest right now deserved better than being spent on people who were merely following orders. The figure with the tablet lasted marginally longer, drawing a blade of his own and getting exactly 1 swing off before Junho's frost locked his arm solid mid-motion and a shadow blade opened his throat. Torres screamed and bolted for a side door. Junho let her run, not out of mercy. Torres Milo was not the person he needed information from most, and chasing her now would waste time better spent elsewhere. He turned instead toward a heavy door at the back of the lab, one that hummed faintly with containment wards, and tore it open with a burst of frost that shattered the locking mechanism outright. Behind it were the children. There were more than he expected, huddled together in a room that had clearly been designed to look comforting on the surface, soft colors on the walls, toys scattered around, and underneath all of it, monitoring equipment and restraint points that made the comfort feel like exactly the cruel joke it was. Some of the children flinched back at the sight of him, blood on his hands, ice still curling faintly off his fingers. Others simply stared, too exhausted or too broken by whatever they'd already endured to react at all. Junho crouched down slowly, dropping his voice into something gentler than he'd used on anyone in weeks. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. I need to help you, but I need you to trust me for just a few minutes. Can you do that? A small girl near the front, maybe 8 years old, eyes red-tinted faintly at the edges, from whatever dosage they'd already been given, nodded slowly, more out of exhaustion than actual trust. He worked through the room child by child, laying a hand over each one, drawing out the demonic corruption the same way he'd pulled the sickness from the VIP's daughter weeks earlier. It took longer this time, the corruption deeper, more entrenched, fighting to stay rooted in bodies that had absorbed it over weeks or months rather than days. Frost spread and receded around his hands with every extraction, and with every child he cleared, his own magic stat ticked upward, an ugly kind of efficiency he refused to think about too closely while he worked. By the time he finished the last child, hours had passed, and every single one of them, nearly 30 in total, sat clear-eyed and shaking, the red tint gone from their irises entirely. He called it in anonymously afterward, an emergency services tip precise enough to guarantee a fast response, generic enough to avoid tracing back to him. Torres Milo didn't get far. Junho found her 2 days later hiding in a rented apartment on the outskirts of the city, having assumed, wrongly, that fleeing the country would take priority over fleeing quietly. She opened her door expecting a delivery and found instead the same donor from 2 days prior, except now his face carried none of the polite warmth it had worn during the tour. "You," she breathed, already backing away. "You're the one who—" "I am," Junho said. She tried to run. He'd expected that. He caught her before she reached the fire escape, and rather than ending things quickly, he took a long moment to make sure she understood exactly what she'd been part of, exactly how many children had suffered because of operations she personally oversaw for over 2 decades. He cut off one of her feet first, calm and clinical, ensuring she had no possibility of running again regardless of what desperation might drive her to try. Her screams filled the small apartment, and Junho let them, unmoved, because somewhere in his memory reading of her earlier fragment, he'd seen the faces of children who'd screamed exactly this loud with nobody coming to help them. What followed was not quick, and it was not merciful, and Junho did not once consider making it either of those things. When it finally ended, hours later, there was very little left of Torres Milo that anyone would ever identify. He walked out of that apartment already thinking about the next name on his list, already turning over the deeper question the memory extraction had confirmed beyond doubt. The demon hierarchy had spent 24 years and hundreds of children's lives trying to recreate his own shadow skill artificially. They'd never once considered what would happen if the original ever found out. The press conference that followed the Paradise raid wasn't something Junho had planned in advance. It happened almost by accident. A swarm of reporters gathering outside the emergency services cordon within hours of the anonymous tip, hungry for details about the mysterious rescue of 30 children from what officials were already calling one of the worst human trafficking operations in a decade. He hadn't intended to speak to any of them, but standing at the edge of that crowd, watching officials struggle to explain a rescue nobody could account for, something in him decided the silence had gone on long enough. He stepped through the barrier tape before anyone could stop him, and the sudden press of cameras and questions might have overwhelmed someone unprepared for that kind of attention. Junho wasn't unprepared. He'd simply been quiet by choice, not by nature. "Who are you?" someone shouted, phone raised, already recording. "Were you the one who rescued those kids?" Junho reached up and pulled the mask from his coat pocket, one he'd kept folded away since waking from the ice, more habit than plan. He put it on slowly, deliberately, letting every camera in the crowd catch the motion clearly. The reaction was immediate. Older reporters, guild veterans standing at the edges of the crowd, people who'd grown up on stories about a legend who vanished 25 years ago, went utterly silent. A mask like that hadn't been seen in public in a generation, and only a handful of people alive still remembered exactly what it meant. "My name is Spectre," Junho said, voice carrying clearly over the sudden hush. "I'm back, and I'm not finished." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. Somewhere in that crowd, phones were already uploading footage that would reach every corner of the world within the hour, and the demon factions who'd spent 24 years grinding through children trying to recreate his power were about to learn, in the worst possible way, that the original had never actually died. Carl Signia had built a reputation among demon executives as someone who never lost, a high-ranking operative whose signature weapon, a massive bow woven from condensed shadow energy, had ended more hunters than anyone cared to count. He came for Junho 3 days after the press conference, not out of orders from above, but out of pure, wounded pride. The idea that a mere rookie exam graduate had slaughtered his way through multiple demon operations offended something deep in him. He ambushed Junho on a quiet street near his apartment. Arrows already knocked before Junho even registered the attack beginning. 3 shots loosed in the span of a single breath, each one aimed to cripple rather than kill outright, the mark of someone who wanted to savor a fight rather than end it quickly. Junho dodged the first 2 and let the third graze his shoulder, testing the weight of this new opponent before committing to anything more aggressive. "You're the one they call the demonic bow," Junho said, straightening from the graze like it barely registered. "And you're the rookie who's been embarrassing my colleagues for weeks." Carl's grin showed teeth that weren't quite human anymore. "I've been looking forward to this." The fight that followed tested Junho more than most of his recent encounters. Carl's bow worked fast, relentless, arrows curving through impossible angles that should have been physically implausible for any normal weapon. Junho weaved through the barrage, closing distance in short, controlled bursts, taking 2 more shallow wounds before finally getting close enough to make the fight personal rather than ranged. Carl's confidence cracked the moment blade met bow at close range, his weapon better suited to distance than the brutal, grinding exchange Junho forced him into. Frost crept up the length of his bow with every parry, slowing his draw speed fractionally each time, and by the 10th exchange, Carl was fighting a losing battle against a weapon that no longer moved the way he needed it to. The end came fast once it arrived. Junho's blade found the gap in Carl's guard, drove through, and the demonic bow's confident sneer finally slipped into something closer to disbelief as he crumpled. Junho crouched to read what remained of his memories, and that was the exact moment a new presence arrived. Footsteps deliberate, unhurried. Someone who clearly wasn't concerned about interrupting whatever had just happened on this street. "That's a mess you've made," a voice said. Junho turned to find an older man standing at the edge of the alley. Plain clothes, unremarkable features, except for eyes that carried the particular kind of weight only decades of serious combat experience produced. Junho recognized the presence immediately, even without official confirmation. Sword Saint Kim, one of the very few names from before the ice who'd survived long enough to still matter. "You've been busy," Kim continued, studying the body at Junho's feet with mild interest rather than alarm. Orphanage massacre, viral videos, and now a dead demon executive on a public street corner. He attacked first. I don't doubt it. Kim's gaze shifted to the mask still covering the lower half of Junho's face. "That's an old design. I haven't seen one like it in a very long time." Junho said nothing, weighing exactly how this conversation was likely to go. "I know who you are," Kim said finally, quiet enough that it wouldn't carry beyond the alley. "I fought alongside people who trained under you, back before you disappeared. I recognized your fighting style in that black market video weeks ago, and I've been quietly making sure certain reports about you never reached anyone who'd asked too many questions. Why? Because the world needs Spectre back a great deal more than it needs answers about how you survived 25 years frozen in ice." Kim's expression didn't shift. "I'll keep covering for you. Officially, this body belongs to an unresolved gang dispute. Unofficially, we both know exactly what it is." Junho studied the old swordsman for a long moment, searching for some angle, some hidden cost to the offer. He found none, only the tired patience of someone who'd clearly spent years hoping for exactly this outcome without ever quite believing it would happen. "Thank you," he said finally. "Don't thank me yet." Kim turned to leave, pausing once at the mouth of the alley. "The demon hierarchy knows your name now. That door doesn't close again." He wasn't wrong. The weeks following the Carl Signia incident moved fast, faster than anything since Junho's awakening. His name spread through every guild, every hunter network, every corner of the demon hierarchy's remaining structure, and with it came both opportunity and exactly the kind of attention Kim had warned him about. He used the momentum deliberately. Job offers poured in from guilds desperate to recruit the man behind the viral footage, and he turned down every single one, uninterested in guild politics when his actual goal sat 2 full realms above the one he currently occupied. Gong Juha reached out personally more than once, increasingly certain that the mysterious rookie and the returned legend Spectre were connected somehow, though she hadn't yet pieced together exactly how. What mattered more than any of it was the door Shim finally managed to open through months of careful negotiation with the association's oversight board. the second floor, the frontier, a ruined fantasy world called the Ruben Empire, sitting exactly one step above the only floor humanity had managed to clear in 25 years. Junho stood at the threshold of the dimensional elevator on the morning of his departure. The Frost Queen perched on his shoulder, complaining loudly about being dragged away from her television, and looked up at the shimmering gate that would carry him somewhere no living human had spent meaningful time in over 2 decades. His friends were still frozen somewhere beyond this gate's reach, waiting for a strength he was still building one fight at a time. But for the first time since waking, the path forward felt like it was finally widening rather than narrowing. He stepped through. The frontier hit him like a physical wall the moment he stepped through the gate. Air thicker, gravity subtly different, the sky itself a shade of gray-violet no Earth sunset ever produced. The Ruben Empire had once been a thriving fantasy kingdom, according to what little intelligence the Association had gathered over 8 years of failed expeditions. Now it was mostly ruin, crumbling towers and dead farmland, stretching toward mountains that never seemed to get any closer, no matter how long a party marched toward them. The nearest human settlement was a cramped, overcrowded way station called Gilly Castle, built into the shell of what used to be a much grander fortress. A few thousand hunters lived there in various states of desperation, all of them stuck at the bottleneck that had stalled humanity's advance for nearly a decade. Junio didn't waste time on introductions. He needed local currency, local information, and a fast read on how power actually worked in this new territory. And the quickest way to get all three at once was the gambling den tucked into the castle's lower levels. The kind of place where every faction's information eventually leaked out over cards and dice. The den's current king was a broad-shouldered mercenary captain named Doyle, someone who'd built a small empire out of intimidation and rigged games over 3 years of controlling the only real entertainment this miserable outpost offered. He noticed the newcomer within minutes, the way every predator in a closed ecosystem noticed fresh meat wandering into their territory. "New arrival," Doyle said, sliding into the seat across from Junho without invitation. "You'll want to lose your first game gracefully. Keeps things friendly." "I don't lose games gracefully," Junho said. "I don't lose games at all." Doyle's grin faltered slightly at the flat certainty in that response. The game that followed was quick and merciless, Junho reading the table's tells with the same patient precision he applied to reading a battlefield, and within 20 minutes he'd taken every coin Doyle had brought to the table along with the deed to a modest storage unit the man had wagered out of wounded pride. Word moved through Gilly Castle fast after that. By evening, 3 other groups had tried their luck at the same table, and by the following morning, Junho controlled enough local currency and enough grudging respect that information started flowing toward him instead of away. That was how he learned about Rakan. Rakan had been a mercenary once, the kind who cleared minor portal contracts for coin before retiring to the frontier's edges with a wife whose health had been failing for years, worn down by a wasting condition the local healers couldn't touch. He'd spent his retirement savings chasing rumors of a cure, each one ending in disappointment, until the last rumor led him to something called the Cobalt Tomb, a ruin said to house a healing relic strong enough to fix what medicine couldn't. He was gathering a small crew for one final expedition when Junho found him in a tavern near the castle's edge, exhaustion carved into every line of his weathered face. "You're the one who cleaned out Doyle's table," Rakan said, not quite a question. "I am. I need someone strong for a job. I can't pay much, but there's a relic in it worth more to me than money." Rakan's hands tightened around his cup. "My wife doesn't have much time left." Junho studied him for a long moment, recognizing something familiar in the desperate hope behind the man's request, an echo of his own reasons for climbing this ladder floor by floor. "Tell me about the tomb." The Cobalt Tomb sat 2 days' travel from Gilly Castle, an ancient burial site corrupted years ago by demon energy that had seeped into the ground from a nearby rift. What used to guard sacred relics inside now guarded them as twisted, demon-infused constructs, the strongest among them a creature the locals called the Cobalt Champion, a fusion of ancient armor and demonic corruption that had killed every previous expedition sent to retrieve the healing statue. Junho agreed to the job without negotiating the pay. Some things weren't about the coin. The tomb itself was exactly as grim as Rakan's description suggested. Corridors lined with faded murals depicting a kingdom's proud history, all of it half buried under corruption that pulsed faintly with the same red-tinted wrongness Junho had grown intimately familiar with over the past months. Rakan's small crew, 3 hired hands barely competent enough to survive the outer chambers, stayed close to the entrance while Junho pushed deeper alone, unwilling to risk their lives on a threat he suspected none of them could actually handle. The Cobalt Champion waited in the tomb's central chamber, a hulking suit of ancient armor animated by corrupted energy, twin blades extending from its forearms in place of hands. It moved the moment Junho crossed the threshold. No words, no warning, just immediate, overwhelming aggression that had clearly ended every expedition sent against it before now. The fight was brutal and fast, the champion's corrupted strength genuinely dangerous in ways Junho hadn't quite expected from a frontier-tier guardian, several blows landing hard enough to crack stone pillars behind him when he ducked beneath them. But brutal strength without technique had never been enough to trouble him. Not in his old life and not now, and he found the gaps in the champion's armor through patient observation rather than raw power, freezing joints one at a time until the great construct's movements slowed to something he could dismantle piece by piece. The final strike drove clean through the champion's chest plate, and the demonic corruption animating it shrieked once, high and inhuman, before the whole construct collapsed into inert metal and ash. The healing statue sat beyond the champion's fallen body, exactly as the old legends described, carved from stone that shifted through 5 distinct colors, depending on the angle of the light. Junho carried it back out to where Rakan waited, watching the older man's hands shake as he took the relic, tears already gathering before he'd even confirmed it worked. "Thank you," Rakan said, voice cracking. "You don't know what this means." Junho did know, better than Rakan could possibly guess. He said nothing about it, simply nodded, and turned to leave before the older man could see whatever expression had crossed his own face. Word reached him 3 days later, through Shim's careful information network, that Rakan's wife Sophia had woken clear-eyed for the first time in over a year, the statue's healing properties working exactly as the old legends promised. The couple had spent their last coin chasing that cure, and what little Junho had learned of their finances during the job suggested medical debts stacked high enough to bury them regardless of whether Sophia recovered. Junho left a modest fortune of gold at their doorstep the following night. Anonymous, no note, no explanation. He was already gone before the sun rose, walking back toward Gilly Castle with the Frost Queen complaining on his shoulder about the cold frontier nights. The Gilly Castle Cobalt Subjugation Force existed for exactly one purpose: to organize a serious push against the Rhino Mountains, a range that supposedly held the key to advancing past the second floor entirely. Command had been trying to build a force capable of that push for years, and entry requirements had grown correspondingly brutal, a test designed to filter out anyone who wasn't genuinely strong enough to survive what waited beyond the mountains. Junyo arrived at the testing grounds on a gray morning, alongside a crowd of several hundred hopeful applicants ranging from seasoned frontier veterans to green recruits who'd clearly underestimated exactly what they'd volunteered for. One recruit caught his attention almost immediately, a lean, unremarkable-looking man standing slightly apart from the crowd, running through basic stretches with the kind of disciplined focus that had nothing to do with raw talent and everything to do with sheer accumulated repetition. Junho recognized that particular quality instantly, having spent decades around fighters who compensated for weak starting gifts with brutal, unglamorous dedication. "First attempt?" Junho asked, falling into step beside him. "16th year of training," the man said without looking up from his stretches. "First attempt at this particular test, though." "Name's Baek Kyung-woo. You've been training 16 years and this is your first real test?" Baek's mouth twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. "I have 0 natural talent. None. My stats grow slower than anyone else's I've ever met. Everything I have, I built by hand, 1 rep at a time, for 16 years. He finally looked over, meeting Junho's gaze directly. "My family died in a portal collapse when I was young. I couldn't do anything to help them then. I promised myself I'd never be that helpless again." Something about the man's flat, unadorned honesty struck a chord Junho hadn't expected. He'd spent his entire old life surrounded by prodigies, geniuses, people whose raw talent made them formidable before they'd earned a single scar. Baek Kyung-woo represented something different entirely, a testament to the idea that willpower alone, applied relentlessly over enough years, could carve out strength the universe never intended to grant. "You'll pass," Junho said. "You don't know that. I know exactly what 16 years of that kind of discipline looks like on a person. Junho nodded toward the testing arena ahead. Trust it. The entry test itself was straightforward in concept, brutal in execution. Each applicant faced a frontier knight, a seasoned local fighter contracted specifically to evaluate candidates through genuine, live combat rather than simulated trials. Passing meant surviving 3 minutes without being incapacitated. Most candidates lasted less than 1. Junyo's turn came near the middle of the roster. The knight assigned to him was a grizzled veteran named Pharaoh, armor scarred from actual campaigns rather than ceremonial polish, clearly unimpressed by the rookie standing across from him. "Try not to disappoint me too quickly," Pharaoh said, settling into a ready stance. Junyo didn't bother settling into anything. Pharaoh closed the distance fast, blade sweeping in a textbook opening strike meant to test a candidate's basic reflexes, and found his weapon caught, redirected, and turned back against him before he'd even finished the motion. The knight stumbled, recovered, tried again with genuine intent this time, and met the exact same result, each attack read and countered before it could develop into anything dangerous. Within 10 seconds, Pharaoh found himself disarmed, his own blade resting lightly against his throat, held by a man who hadn't broken a sweat. The proctors overseeing the test went very quiet. "Test not over," Pharaoh said, voice tight with something between frustration and genuine unease. 3 minutes. "You'll lose again if we continue," Junho said, lowering the blade. "There's no reason to waste both our time." Pharaoh stared at him for a long moment, then turned toward the proctor's booth and gave a short, sharp nod. Passed. No further evaluation needed. Baek Kyung-woo's test came 2 rounds later, and it looked nothing like Junho's effortless dismantling of Pharaoh. Baek fought hard, every technique clearly drilled thousands of times over 16 relentless years, taking hits and giving them back in equal measure, grinding through the full 3 minutes on pure accumulated skill rather than any natural gift. He finished the test bruised, bleeding from a cut above one eyebrow, and utterly triumphant, grinning through the pain like he'd just won something far bigger than a simple entry exam. Junho found him afterward, sitting on a supply crate while a medic wrapped his ribs. "Told you," Junho said. "You got lucky," Baek shot back, though the grin didn't fade. "Luck doesn't explain 16 years. Baek's grin softened into something quieter, more sincere. "Thanks for saying I'd pass. I didn't believe it until I was standing in there, but I remembered it anyway." Helped, somehow. By the time the full roster of applicants had been evaluated, the subjugation force stood at 671 members, the largest coordinated push toward the Ryano Mountains that Gilly Castle had ever assembled. Junyo stood among them in the assembly yard as the commanding officer read out deployment orders, flanked by seasoned veterans, desperate volunteers, and at least one man who'd spent 16 years building himself from nothing into someone capable of standing in this exact formation. The Frost Queen shifted on his shoulder, peering out at the assembled force with faint, grudging approval. "This is a lot of humans for one mountain. The mountain's supposedly worth it. Everything you chase is supposedly worth it." She settled back down, tail curling around itself. "You should still get me more ice cream before we march." Junho almost smiled again. Ahead of the formation, the Ryano Mountains rose jagged and distant against the gray-violet sky, holding whatever answers waited for humanity's next real step forward. And somewhere far beyond that, closer now than it had been in 25 frozen years, his friends were still waiting for him to come strong enough to bring them home. He'd come a long way from a rookie exam nobody expected him to walk away from. He had further still to go.